He thought she was nothing without him, but when fate brought them together again, he realized how wrong he was. The clink of crystal goblets resounded through the ballroom of the Grand Royal Hotel, one of the most luxurious venues in the city. It was the event of the year, the Valentine's Day dinner that brought together the most influential people in the country. The atmosphere exuded wealth, exclusivity, and power. Everyone there belonged to the very top of society. Michael Parker entered the room as if he owned the place. He had always been like that, a man who liked to be in the spotlight. His tailored suit, confident posture, and the smile of someone who has never known the word defeat showed that he knew the impact he was making. Next to him, Stephanie shone like a trophy, young, stunning, perfect. Her red dress hugged her curves in a provocative way. Her flawless makeup highlighted her perfect skin, and her eyes carried that seductive sparkle that made him feel invincible. "Everyone's looking at us," she murmured, taking his arm with a satisfied smile. Michael glanced around and nodded, satisfied. They should be. He liked the attention. He loved the looks of admiration and envy. He was the top of the food chain and made a point of reminding everyone of it. He walked around the hall greeting entrepreneurs, influencers, and celebrities. Every handshake was strategic. Every smile was calculated. That's how he stayed in power, always one step ahead of everyone else. But there was something different in the air that night. The buzz in the hall seemed more intense, as if something or someone had altered the dynamics of the event. He ignored it at first. He assumed it was just his arrival stealing the limelight, as was always the case. But then he realized, all eyes were no longer on him and his trophy girlfriend. People murmured to each other, exchanging expressions of surprise. Some looked in the direction of the entrance to the hall, while others seemed to be holding their breath. It was as if a silent earthquake had just struck, and Michael still didn't know where it had come from. Frowning, he followed the direction of the gazes, and then he saw her. For a second, the world around him stopped. The woman who had just walked in was not a stranger. On the contrary, she was a ghost from his past. Esther. But not the Esther he remembered, not the lackluster, predictable and submissive wife he left behind without remorse, not the woman who cried while he despised her and left her for another. The Esther who now walked down the hall was different. She wasn't just beautiful. She was an event. Her long black dress, elegant and impeccably tailored, seemed made for her. Her hair, once always tied up in simple ponytails, now fell in perfectly tidy waves. But it was in her eyes that the real transformation took place, cold, confident, calculated. She was no longer the woman he had discarded, and she wasn't alone. Next to her stood a man who exuded presence. Tall, in a perfectly tailored suit, with an undeniable air of power. He didn't look like just any escort. He seemed to belong to her, or perhaps the other way around. Michael felt the bitter taste of surprise in his mouth. His jaw went rigid. There was something about the way Esther walked, the way her posture radiated control and class, that bothered him deeply. Stephanie, noticing the stiffness in Michael's body, followed his gaze. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice laden with curiosity and a hint of suspicion. Michael opened his mouth, but couldn't answer immediately. That was Esther, the woman he had abandoned. The woman who, in his mind, should have been destroyed. But there in front of him was no shadow of destruction, and then something happened that caught him even more off guard. Esther's eyes met his. Before continuing, like the video to support the channel, and if you like the story, comment with an emoji. For a moment, everything around him disappeared. He expected something. Anger, pain, resentment. Something that would show that, somehow, he still existed for her. But what he saw was nothing. No emotion. No recognition that he had even been part of her life one day. It was as if he was just another stranger in the crowd. And then she looked away. She moved on, without haste, without hesitation, without even a trace of sorrow, as if he had never existed. Michael felt something he couldn't name. Stephanie gripped his arm tighter. "Michael!" she called out, trying to get his attention. He didn't answer. That evening, which was supposed to be just another event celebrating Valentine's Day, was taking an unexpected turn, and he didn't like surprises. But one thing was certain. Esther was no longer the woman he had left behind, and something inside him told him that he was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The past came back like a treacherous blow, cutting through the false security Michael had always had that he had made the right choice. He couldn't take his eyes off Esther. Her every move seemed calculated, as if she knew exactly the impact she was making. But what tormented him most wasn't her transformed beauty or the man beside her. It was the coldness in her gaze, the total indifference. Had she really forgotten him? Stephanie noticed Michael's discomfort. Her slender fingers slid down his arm, and her honeyed voice that had once charmed him sounded irritating. "Michael, who is this woman?" she repeated impatiently. It took him a second to answer. "Nobody important," he muttered, but his mind was telling him otherwise. He tried to convince himself that he didn't care, that it was just a coincidence, but his own reaction betrayed him. Something inside him twisted, as if he were facing a mistake that could never be corrected. And then his mind took him back to the past, the day he left her, the day he destroyed the heart of the only person who had ever truly loved him. The rain was beating against the windows of the luxurious penthouse apartment, but the real storm was raging inside. Esther was standing in the middle of the room, her breathing uneven, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her face was pale, as if her world was collapsing before her eyes. "What?" Her voice came out in a whisper, as if she hoped she had heard wrong. Michael, impassive, straightened his shirt cuffs and let out an impatient sigh. "Esther, I don't want this anymore. I don't want to be with you anymore." She blinked several times, trying to process those words. Her mind refused to accept them. "But, Michael, I've been by your side for years, from the very beginning, when you had nothing." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know, Esther, but things have changed. I've changed." She moved closer, touching his hand, pleading with her eyes. "Changed how? I've been with you every step of the way. When you lost that first big contract and thought you'd never get back on your feet, I was there. When you spent sleepless nights trying to get your company off the ground, I stayed up with you. When no one believed in you, I did." He pushed her hand away coldly. "And that's exactly the problem. You still see me as that guy struggling to survive. But I'm not that man anymore. I'm someone bigger now. And you—" He hesitated for a moment, but then said the words that cut like a blade. "You've settled, Esther. I need someone who can measure up to me." Esther remained motionless. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, as if she had been punched in the stomach. "Have I settled?" Her voice trembled. Michael snorted, crossing his arms. "Look at you, always wearing the same simple clothes, always worrying about little things. You don't understand this world I'm in now. I go to lavish events, dine with CEOs and stars, travel to private islands. I need someone who can accompany me. How am I going to take you like this?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Are you leaving me for someone else?" His silence was the answer. Esther's heart squeezed so hard that she thought it would fall apart right then and there. "Who is she?" He didn't hesitate. "Stephanie." The name sounded like poison to Esther. She took a step away and then another, as if she needed to put distance between them in order to breathe. I don't believe it." Michael nonchalantly picked up an envelope from the table and handed it to her. "Here are the divorce papers. I've already arranged everything. You can keep the apartment in the suburbs and a pension of $500 a month for a year. After that, you'll be on your own." She looked at the envelope in her hands, feeling as if it weighed tons. "Are you kicking me out of our house?" "It's my house, you know," he corrected. "And I think you'd better move out as soon as possible so we don't have to suffer." The tears were now threatening to overflow, but she didn't want to give him the taste. "Are you really doing this? After everything we've been through together?" Michael didn't look away. "Yes. I'm going to spend this weekend traveling while you get whatever you want out of the house. I left the key to your apartment on the bed with your first payment of $500. I've also arranged for a truck to move you on Sunday. The final word. The point of no return." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if she needed to gather her strength. When she opened them again, something inside her had changed. There was pain, there was suffering, but there was also something new, a flame that Michael didn't recognize. She said nothing more. She just took the envelope, lifted her chin and walked out the door without looking back. Michael watched as she disappeared, and he felt nothing, or at least that's what he convinced himself. Back in the present, Michael blinked and the vision of Esther in the Grand Royal lounge returned. But she was no longer the woman who left that apartment defeated years ago. She had been reborn from the ashes, and he couldn't understand how it had happened. His chest tightened with a strange discomfort. Had he made the biggest mistake of his life? Stephanie, still holding his arm, frowned. "Michael, why are you so tense?" He swallowed, looking away from Esther. "I'm not." But he knew he was lying. And for the first time in a long time, he felt afraid of what was to come. Because something inside him told him that tonight would change everything. The air around Michael seemed dense, as if the whole room had turned into a bubble where only he and Esther existed. He tried to look away, tried to ignore her presence, but it was impossible. Every soft laugh she let out, every glance she exchanged with the man next to her, made his chest tighten. He didn't understand why it bothered him so much. He wasn't a man who regretted things. He didn't look back. His life was about achievement, growth, moving forward without hesitation. He made his choice years ago, and for him, that was final. So why did he feel that somehow time had taken a cruel turn and was now laughing at him? Stephanie, next to him, still held his arm, but was no longer smiling. Her gaze alternated between Michael and Esther, as if she were putting together the pieces of a puzzle she didn't like putting together. Michael's discomfort did not go unnoticed by her. She slowly turned to look at Esther once more. And that's when it all made sense. A shiver ran through her body. She knew this woman. Not in person, but from conversations, whispers, and deleted messages on Michael's cell phone at the beginning of their relationship. Esther, the wife he gave up for her. Stephanie's heart raced. In the first few months when she started going out with Michael, she knew he was still married. But he always spoke of his wife with contempt. He said she was an unambitious woman who had become dead weight, someone who no longer suited him. Stephanie believed him. He made her believe that Esther was just a shadow from the past, a woman who could never measure up to her. But now, looking at the scene before her eyes, she felt something turn in her stomach. Esther was not the faded woman Michael had described. She was beautiful, sophisticated, radiant, and worse. She wasn't alone. The man next to her held her waist protectively, leaning over to whisper something in her ear. Esther smiled softly before replying. There was affection between them. There was intimacy. Stephanie felt a wave of relief. If Esther was with her, it meant that she had gotten over Michael, that she had moved on. It meant that Michael was in the past for her, and consequently, it meant that Michael shouldn't be reacting the way he was. Stephanie slowly turned her face towards her boyfriend, observing every detail of his expression, the clenched jaw, the clenched fists. His eyes were too fixed, too hard, following Esther's every move as if he were trying to decipher something. An irritation began to grow inside her. "You didn't tell me she was fine like this," Stephanie blurted out, trying to sound casual, but her voice carried a slight acid tone. Michael blinked as if snapped out of a trance. He turned to Stephanie, frowning. "What?" She crossed her arms. "Your ex-wife. You always talked to me about her as if she was a poor thing, as if she'd sunk after the divorce, but look at her." She tilted her head slightly in Esther's direction. "That's not what I'd call someone ruined." Michael ran his tongue over his lips, looking away quickly. "I haven't seen her since we split up. I had no idea she had someone." Stephanie narrowed her eyes. "That's it?" He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that was growing inside him. "That's it?" But Stephanie wasn't convinced. The problem wasn't that Esther was accompanied. The problem was Michael's reaction. He was restless, tense, and worst of all, he seemed unable to take his eyes off his ex-wife. Esther, for her part, didn't even look in his direction. She was laughing, exchanging complicit glances with her boyfriend. They seemed to be in love at that romantic dinner. She was completely immersed in her own reality. And that made Michael seem like a spectator of what could have been her life. Stephanie shifted in her chair, uncomfortable, This was supposed to be a special evening, a lavish dinner, a moment for them to shine as the perfect couple. But instead, she felt as if she had been pushed into the background. That wasn't acceptable. She wasn't the kind of woman to be left on the sidelines. Was Michael too restless? Was Esther playing too indifferent? Well, she would sort it out now. Stephanie picked up her glass of wine and put it back on the table with a soft clink. "I'll go and talk to her." Michael's eyes widened. "What?" She stood up slowly, straightening her tight red dress with a determined look. "This is ridiculous, Michael. If you're right for each other, there's no reason for this situation to get so awkward. I'm going over to say hi." Michael felt his stomach sink. "Stephanie, that's not necessary." She arched an eyebrow. "Isn't it? Then why do you seem so nervous?" He opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Stephanie just gave him a satisfied smile. "I'll be right back." And then, without waiting for any more protests, she started walking towards Esther. Michael watched, feeling a wave of anxiety rise up inside him. He knew it wouldn't end well. Stephanie crossed the hall with firm steps, but her every move was meticulously calculated. She didn't want to appear anxious, let alone show that her initial intention was to confront Esther. That wouldn't make sense, not after what she had just realized. As she passed the table where Esther was sitting, something abruptly caught her eye. The man next to her. For an instant, Stephanie felt her heart stop. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly controlled her expression. She knew that man. Not personally, but well enough for his name to be engraved in her memory. Nathaniel Carter. One of the richest and most influential men in the country, CEO of one of America's largest financial holding companies, powerful, ruthless, coveted. And more than that, a man Stephanie had tried to win over years ago, long before she met Michael. She remembered it well. She remembered the time she went to an event just to try to get close to him. She remembered how she tried to strike up a conversation, how she played up her charm, how she tried to get him to notice her. But Nathaniel Carter never saw her. He was not a man easily impressed. And now, there he was, next to Esther. Stephanie felt a tightness in her chest, a mixture of surprise and frustration. How was this possible? How had Esther, the woman she had always imagined to be bland and dull, managed to win over a man like him? Not knowing how to react, Stephanie changed direction at the last second and went into the bathroom, pretending that this had been her plan all along. If she went to Esther now, she would only humiliate herself. She leaned against the marble sink, taking a deep breath. What the hell was going on? Tonight was supposed to be about her and Michael, but instead, she felt like she was missing out on something. She felt like the tables were turning before her eyes. After a few minutes of pulling herself together, she left the bathroom and returned to the table. Michael was still tense, his eyes focused on where Esther was, but now he was trying to disguise his unease. Stephanie slid back into her seat, crossing her legs and letting out an audible sigh. "Do you know who her boyfriend is?" Michael finally looked away and frowned. "Who?" She leaned closer to him, as if she were sharing an important secret. "Nathaniel Carter." The name made something in Michael's face change. He blinked once, then again, before reaching into his jacket pocket for his cell phone. Stephanie watched as he typed furiously into Google, his expression becoming more and more charged as he read the results. Nathaniel Carter was a legend in the business world, a tycoon who had built an empire, who was always on the cover of magazines, who was respected and admired by everyone. And now he was Esther's boyfriend. Michael slid his finger across the screen, opening a recent article. His pupils dilated when he saw a photo of Esther next to Nathaniel, smiling for the cameras at a gala event. Nathaniel Carter takes up relationship with Esther Sullivan, up-and-coming CEO. CEO? Michael blinked, confused. He opened another article, then another, and there it was. Esther wasn't just Nathaniel Carter's girlfriend. She was a powerful woman now, a woman with a name, influence, prestige. She had done exactly what he had thought impossible. She had won. Without him. Stephanie huffed, irritated, and snatched the cell phone from his hand. "Michael, for God's sake, stop it!" He blinked, as if awakening from a trance. "What's wrong?" "What is it?" she repeated, incredulous. "Today is Valentine's Day. Are you going to spend all night researching your ex-wife and her boyfriend?" Michael looked away but didn't answer. Stephanie crossed her arms, feeling a growing anger. "I don't believe that. Tonight should be about us, but instead, you're obsessed with her." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his fingers against his temple. "I was just surprised, that's all. I didn't expect to see her here." "You didn't expect to see her here, or you didn't expect to see her so well," Stephanie retorted, with venom in her voice. Michael stared at her but said nothing. The answer was in his expression. Stephanie let out a dry laugh and picked up her wine glass, taking a long sip. Unbelievable. Dinner arrived. Expensive dishes, impeccably served. But Michael hardly ate. He pushed the food around on his plate, his mind far away. Every laugh from Esther across the room was like a reminder that he was no longer part of her life, and that bothered him more than he would ever admit. Stephanie, for her part, was becoming increasingly impatient. She had spent the whole evening trying to keep control of the situation, trying to pretend that none of it was affecting her. But the truth was that this was, without a doubt, the worst Valentine's Day night of her life. Michael wasn't there with her. Physically, yes, but his mind was stuck on another table, stuck on another woman. When Michael finally put down his cutlery and let out a frustrated sigh, Stephanie knew what was coming next. "Let's go," he said dryly. She stared at him, furious. "Now?" He was already reaching for his jacket, ready to get up. "Yes." Stephanie felt her blood boil. "Really, Michael, this is how this evening is going to end." He looked at her impatiently. "I'm tired." She let out an ironic laugh. "Tired? Funny. You weren't tired before you saw your ex-wife here." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if trying to contain himself. "Come on, Stephanie." She stared at him for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, jutted out her chin and stood up, trying to hide how hurt she was. Across the hall, Esther noticed the movement. She saw Michael stand up. She saw him look in her direction, and instead of ignoring him completely as before, she did something different. She gently held Nathaniel's face and without rushing gave him a soft kiss. It wasn't just any kiss. It was a demonstration kiss. Michael felt his chest tighten with anger. He knew she had done it on purpose. And worst of all, it had worked. Stephanie held his arm tightly, as if she felt something was slipping through her fingers. Michael looked away and left the room with her. But something was growing inside him, something he couldn't understand, something he didn't want to feel. But it was too late. The car door slammed shut and the silence between Michael and Stephanie was almost palpable. The driver of the luxury car was waiting for instructions, but Michael didn't even look at him. He was tense, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the window as if he was looking for an answer in the reflection of the illuminated city. Stephanie crossed her arms, tapping a foot against the floor, trying to contain the frustration that was growing inside her. The night had been a disaster. She wanted to scream, she wanted to confront him right there, she wanted him to at least pretend that he cared about her in the same way that he obsessed over Esther. But she didn't want to humiliate herself, not yet. "Where to, Mr. Parker?" the driver asked, unaware of the charged atmosphere inside the car. It took Michael a few seconds to answer. "Home." Stephanie rolled her eyes and let out a sarcastic laugh. "Oh, now you want to go home? After ruining the whole evening?" Michael finally looked at her, but his expression was cold. "I didn't ruin anything, Stephanie." She arched an eyebrow in disbelief. "You didn't ruin anything? You spent the whole night obsessing about your ex-wife, Googling her and her boyfriend, ignoring me. You barely touched your food, and now you want to act like nothing happened?" Michael ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "I'm not obsessed, I was just surprised." "Surprised?" She let out a dry laugh. "You weren't surprised, Michael. You were annoyed. Annoyed. And you want to know what else? I think you still have feelings for her." Michael froze. Stephanie noticed and stared at him, waiting for his reaction. But he just looked away and said nothing. Silence was the answer. Stephanie felt her stomach turn. She had always known that Michael was not a romantic man. He liked power, status, and control. But until that night, She had believed that she was the one who stood next to him at the top. Now, everything seemed different. Esther's presence messed everything up. Stephanie leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms, staring out of the window as the car sped through the city's luxurious streets. With every minute, her irritation grew. She wasn't going to lose to Esther. Not now. Not after everything she had done to win Michael over. When they arrived at the penthouse, Michael got out of the car without saying a word. He walked to the elevator, deep in thought. Stephanie followed, her heels echoing across the marble floor. As soon as they entered the apartment, Michael took off his jacket and threw it on the sofa. Stephanie watched him for a moment before finally breaking the silence. "If you're so bothered, why don't you call her?" He turned to face her, surprised by the provocation. "What are you saying?" She crossed her arms, staring at him. "If you're so restless, so distracted, so disturbed by her presence, then maybe you should go over there. Ask her how she is. Find out if she's really moved on." Michael let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "This is ridiculous." "Is it? Because honestly, I've never seen you like this." The silence between them became heavy. Stephanie realized something that made her shudder inside. Michael wasn't denying it. He could say he didn't care, but his actions screamed otherwise, and it consumed her. Michael picked up a glass of whiskey and took a long sip, as if trying to swallow something other than the drink. Stephanie narrowed her eyes, her mind working fast. She wouldn't be replaced. She wouldn't be discarded like Esther had been. She needed to act before it was too late. But Michael wasn't ready to admit anything yet, not even to himself. As the city sparkled outside the panoramic window, he continued to stand there, staring into his glass of whiskey, lost in thoughts he didn't want to have. And, somewhere on the other side of town, Esther probably didn't even remember him. And that was the worst part. The lounge of the Grand Royal Hotel was slowly emptying, but Esther was still there, sitting next to Nathaniel, her hand entwined in his. He was talking about a new project he was working on, but at a certain point, he noticed that she was distant. "What?" She blinked and smiled softly, shaking her head. "It's nothing. I'm just tired." Nathaniel didn't look convinced, but he didn't insist. He just brought her hand to his lips and kissed her fingers. "Shall we go home?" She nodded. They stood up, and as they passed the almost empty hall, Esther's eyes fell on the table where Michael and Stephanie had been standing earlier. It was empty. They had already left. She should have felt something about that. But she didn't. Not like before. The past was just that. The past. Nathaniel pulled her by the waist, and she let him lead her out of the hall without looking back. Michael couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, while his mind revolved around a single image: the kiss. The kiss Esther had given Nathaniel before she left. He knew it was to provoke him. He knew she wanted to show him how well she was doing, how much she had overcome. But why had it hit him so hard? He closed his eyes, trying to push the thought away, but it was useless. He turned over in bed, feeling a growing discomfort. Something inside him told him that this story wasn't over yet, and he hated the idea of having no control over it. On the other side of the bed, Stephanie was sleeping with her back to him, or at least she pretended to, because she also knew that this story was far from over, and she wasn't going to sit back and wait to see what would happen. The days passed, but nothing seemed to return to normal. Michael felt like he was trapped in a cycle of thoughts from which he couldn't escape. He would go to work, attend meetings, close contracts, but his mind was never fully present. He would come home to find Stephanie with her expensive clothes, new perfumes and shopping bags scattered around the apartment. But nothing seemed to satisfy him. He took her around the waist, kissed her, tried to convince himself that he still wanted it, that Stephanie was everything a man like him should want. And for a few moments, he believed it. Until in the middle of the night, while she slept next to him, he took out his cell phone and looked for Esther. It was a habit that had started without him realizing it. First, it was just a quick look on Instagram, then on business websites. Soon, he knew where she'd been over the last few days, what events she'd attended, who she'd met up with. He found out more about her new life than he'd like to admit. After the breakup, Esther stayed out of the spotlight for a while. But then, without his realizing it, she emerged as a force in the business world. She began working discreetly as a financial consultant, used her old contacts to create opportunities and, little by little, built up her reputation. Then, one day, she caught the eye of Nathaniel Carter. It was he who opened doors for her. Nathaniel bet on her talent, trusted her vision, and when she proved her worth, brought her into his company. Now Esther wasn't just his girlfriend, she was his partner. And Michael hated the fact that he hadn't seen it happen. Stephanie noticed the change in him. At first she got angry, but then she pretended not to care. She pretended to be the understanding girlfriend who wouldn't let one night ruin their relationship. But inside she was more alert than ever. She knew what was going on. Michael was obsessed with Esther, and that meant that, sooner or later, he would do to her exactly what he had done to Esther years ago. She refused to be discarded. That's why she started to act out. She smiled more, pretended that everything was perfect, that there was no tension between them. At the same time, she used every moment to take advantage of the situation. She knew that Michael wasn't paying attention to the details now. She knew he didn't notice her frequent trips to the mall, the lavish dinners she arranged without telling him, the valuables that were gradually disappearing from the apartment. And most importantly, she knew he didn't look at her bank statement. Michael had always been careless with money. For him, losing a few $1,000s made no difference. But for Stephanie, it was an investment. Every week, she made discreet transfers to an account abroad. Small amounts, always enough not to arouse suspicion. She already knew that the relationship's days were numbered. It wasn't a question of if, but when, he would decide to throw her out. She just wouldn't allow it to happen without guarantees. She had already planned everything. The right day, the right amount, and when she left, she would leave in style. Michael, however, was so lost in his own thoughts that he didn't even suspect. He was still trying to understand why he cared so much. Why was Esther still on his mind? Why did he feel so uncomfortable every time he saw a photo of her smiling next to Nathaniel? He wanted to believe it was just wounded pride. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He had lost something he should never have let go of, and what was worse, he could see it clearly now. That's why, that evening, sitting in his office, staring at his cell phone screen for several minutes, he finally gave in to temptation. He opened the conversation that had been inactive for years. He typed slowly, deleted, rewrote. He took a deep breath, and before he could change his mind, he sent the message. Esther, since the day I saw you, I can't get you out of my head. Esther's cell phone vibrated on the bedside table. She picked it up, unlocked the screen, and saw the name she hadn't expected to see. Her eyes fixed on the message. She remained motionless for a few seconds. Then, slowly, a smile of pure irony appeared on her lips. Michael stared at the phone screen, waiting. 1 minute, 2, 5. Nothing. The message was delivered. He saw the notice. She had read it, but no reply came. His chest tightened. He didn't know what to expect, but complete ignorance was not a possibility he had even considered. Esther could have cursed. She could have made a cruel irony. She could even have said she didn't want any more contact, but to ignore him completely. He left the chat and logged in again as if that could change anything, but then he realized the send message icon had disappeared. Her profile picture no longer appeared. Her name was grayed out. She had blocked him. The impact was immediate. A mixture of disbelief and frustration overtook him. He let out a heavy sigh, throwing his cell phone down on the table and wiping his hands across his face. This wasn't happening. He stood up abruptly, grabbed a coat from the closet, took his car keys and left without saying a word. Stephanie, who was in her room pretending to sleep, opened her eyes instantly when she heard the door slam. She got up slowly and went to the window. She saw Michael getting into his car and speeding off. She felt a shiver run through her body. Without thinking too much, she grabbed her bag, quickly got out, and got into the first cab that passed by. Follow that black car. The taxi driver looked in the rearview mirror, confused. Boyfriend problem? Stephanie clenched her teeth, her eyes fixed on Michael's car. Just drive. She didn't know where he was going, but she knew it wasn't good. Michael drove through the brightly lit city streets without a clear destination. The steering wheel felt small in his hands, as if he had no control over anything. Esther's lockdown had messed with him more than it should have. He felt like a stranger inside his own body. The car stopped in front of a discreet bar, a place further away from the hustle and bustle of the center. He turned off the engine and stood there for a moment, looking at himself in the rearview mirror. His eyes were heavy. His face looked more tired than ever. He got out of the car and walked into the bar. Stephanie asked the taxi driver to stop a little way back, paid the fare, and waited. When she saw Michael enter, she took a deep breath and decided to follow him. He sat down by the bar and ordered a whiskey. She went inside and stood in a darker corner, watching. Michael didn't seem like the same confident man he always was. He was looking at his cell phone, drinking, tapping his fingers against the bar, lost in thought. Stephanie felt a mixture of satisfaction and anger. He was like that because of Esther. He still wanted her. This only made his plan all the more necessary. She was going to leave, but she was going to make sure that she got out of that relationship with what she deserved. Minutes passed, and then a woman at the table with a friend stood up. Stephanie saw her approaching. Tall, blonde, tight dress. Easy smile. The exact type of woman Michael liked to have around. She struck up a conversation with him. Michael seemed distant at first, but then he smiled. He replied. He made a comment that made the woman laugh and touch his arm. Stephanie crossed her arms, tense. The woman sat down next to Michael. He called the waiter over and ordered another drink, now for her. Stephanie felt her chest tighten. She shouldn't care. She knew Michael wasn't a trustworthy man. After all, that was how she had met him too. He had another woman, he was married. But seeing him there, playing up his cheap charm for another woman, when just a few hours ago he was obsessed with Esther, made her feel a fury that even she hadn't expected. She continued to watch. The two of them talked. The woman laughed at anything he said, leaned closer. And then it happened. Michael kissed her. Time seemed to stop. Stephanie felt her eyes sting, but she blinked quickly to keep the tears at bay. She couldn't afford to be upset. She needed to focus on the plan. But at that moment, everything seemed to fall apart. The kiss lasted longer than necessary, and then Michael stood up, took his wife's hand and left the bar with her. Stephanie swallowed and followed, keeping her distance. She watched as Michael opened the car door for the woman to get in. She watched as they drove off in the direction of the nearest hotel, and she saw them go in together. She stood on the sidewalk, the cold night wind cutting into her skin. She had never felt so pathetic. She had fooled herself into thinking she could control him. She thought she could anticipate any situation, but in the end it was always the same story. Michael loved no one but himself. She took a deep breath, wiped away a solitary tear, and took a cab home. When she entered the apartment, she took off her shoes and went straight to the bedroom. She wasn't going to waste any more time. Michael couldn't imagine what was to come. Without Esther, and now without Stephanie, he would be alone. Stephanie's anger burned inside her like wildfire. Her breathing was heavy, her fingers trembling as she typed rapidly on Michael's laptop. She didn't need to hide anymore. She no longer needed to pretend that she was the faithful girlfriend, the understanding woman. He had betrayed her, not just in thought with his ex-wife, but also with another woman in the street. He deserved what was about to happen. The bank system loaded, and in a few seconds she was inside his account. The balance on the screen flashed almost insultingly. Millions of dollars available, a fortune he had never bothered to monitor. A cynical smile appeared on Stephanie's lips. It was funny. Michael always thought he was the smart one in the relationship, but in the end, he was an arrogant jerk who thought he was untouchable. She typed in the details of the account she had abroad, checked everything one last time, and pressed the transfer button. The amount disappeared from Michael's account and appeared in hers, definitive, irreversible. It was game over. She took his credit card and made another purchase. A one-way ticket to Europe. She was going to spend a season away. No worries, no dramas, no Michael. She went up to her room and started packing. She took everything important, jewelry, clothes, valuables that she could resell if she needed to. Not that he needed to. With the money he had just stolen, he could live well for a long time. Before he left, he made sure to leave something for Michael. He sat down at his office table, took out a piece of paper and a pen, and began to write. Michael, I know that by the time you read this, I'll be long gone. Don't try to look for me. You're not as smart as you think you are, but I know you'll be able to understand what happened. You always thought you could do whatever you wanted without consequences. You always thought you were in control, that you were the smartest man in the room, but guess what? You've been tricked. You've fallen for your own game. You think you're untouchable, but the truth is that you're just a predictable man. You betrayed me, just like you did your ex-wife. The difference? I'm not Esther. Esther was naive. She believed in love. Me? I believe in power. And that's why I'm taking some of your money with me. You must have noticed that when you looked at your account. It was easy, Michael. So easy, it's ridiculous. Now you're on your own, without me, without her, and best of all, you deserve it. Be happy with your own arrogance. Stephanie. She read the letter one last time, satisfied, and left it on the table. She picked up her bags and left without looking back. Michael deserved every second of the emptiness he was about to feel. When Michael arrived home the next morning, extreme tiredness weighed heavily on his shoulders. His head throbbed, the bitter taste of whiskey still in his mouth. He didn't know why he had drunk so much the night before, perhaps to try and forget, maybe not to think about anything. The apartment was silent. He looked around expecting to see Stephanie asleep on the sofa or rummaging through the kitchen for coffee, but there was no sign of her. He called out to her. No answer. Strangely, he walked to the bedroom. The closet was empty. His chest tightened. He opened drawers, looked around, went to the bathroom. Nothing. The realization began to sink in. She was gone. And then, like an unexpected punch, came the memory of Esther. The day he threw her out. The day he watched his wife leave with a suitcase in her hand and never return. Now he was the one who had been left behind. And then something worse happened. He went to his office and saw an envelope on the desk. His initial curiosity turned into a bad feeling in his stomach. He picked up the paper and began to read. Every word was a blow. Every sentence, a reminder that he had been an idiot. Stephanie had planned the whole thing. She hadn't just tricked him. She stole from him. His heart raced. He put down the paper and picked up his laptop, opening his bank account. The balance appeared on the screen. But something was wrong. There was money missing. A lot of money. He clicked on the account details and there it was. A huge transfer, straight to an account abroad. Michael's hands gripped the keyboard tightly, his jaw clenched. He tried to contact the bank, but knew it would be no use. Stephanie wasn't stupid. She had transferred the money in a way that couldn't be recovered. She had defeated him. He slammed the laptop shut and threw it on the table. The silence of the apartment seemed to mock him. He was alone, without Esther, without Stephanie, no money in his account, and with no one to blame but himself. He ran his hands over his face, letting out a low, bitter laugh. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And now, he had no way out. He looked around, feeling the weight of emptiness, feeling the cruel irony of fate. He had always thought he could replace anyone, but this time, he was the one who ended up being discarded. And for the first time in his life, he tasted the bitterness of loneliness. And so ends Michael's story, a man who believed he was always in control, but who, in the end, was defeated by his own ego. He lost everything, the woman who really loved him, the girlfriend he thought he could manipulate, and even part of his fortune. Now we want to know what you think. Do you think Michael deserved what happened to him? Or did Stephanie go too far? Comment below on what you would do in Esther's or Stephanie's place. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories full of drama, overcoming, and twists and turns. See you next time.